It's a pleasure to be joining you virtually for this important conference. I want to focus my comments today on some philosophical and cultural speculations as to why Father Seraphim Rose has been so influential upon many of us in the U.S., myself included, who have found our way into orthodoxy. And specifically, I want to think about Father Seraphim as a reader of cultural nihilism. I see this as a key aspect of his appeal, and in many respects, his sanctity. I'll say in advance that I've been doing a fair amount of scholarly work on the Death to the World movement recently, so I'll take the liberty of using that movement as an example throughout. While Father Seraphim is revered by U.S. and Russian Orthodox especially for his personal sanctity and his insistence on the otherworldly character of Orthodox faith, many of his most famous writings find him with his gaze fixed squarely on his own cultural milieu. I don't mean to discount his beautiful spiritual writings and his work on such figures as Augustine, but it is the case that, especially among North Americans, much of his influence as a writer comes from books such as Nihilism and Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future that are focused on the dangers of the modern age. His body and heart were in his monastic cell and the liturgy. His mind was surveying the world outside. In these works, Father Seraphim constructs a declension narrative of Western civilization as a gradual slide, first into moral relativism, then nihilism, then, in his view, a coming totalitarian age of a dawning New World Order, which for him was the secular preparation for, and instrument of, the spiritual Antichrist. Characteristic of Father Seraphim's historical method is to interweave diagnoses of human prelust, that is, spiritual delusion, conspiracy, millennialist ambition, and spiritual warfare, into signature events of what he sees as the West's apostasy, stemming from the East-West schism, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and so on. Having told that story, he focuses a similar mix of charges upon what he sees as damaging currents of spirituality and culture in his own time, including the increasing popularity of so-called Eastern religions in the West, the charismatic revival in churches, Christian acceptance of theories of evolution, and nascent transhumanist currents. What is crucial to understand about this catalogue of ills from Father Seraphim's perspective is that it is teleological and indeed relentlessly apocalyptic. Each current of presumed self-improvement of humanity or new spiritual gesture is another step towards the coming reign of the Antichrist, as seeded by nihilist post-human theologies. To quote Father Seraphim directly from his Orthodox survival course, I will repeat something that I said in the introductory lecture, that the reason we are doing this is not just to have a view of what is true and what is false, and throw out everything which is false and keep everything which is true, because everything I'm going to be talking about is false. That is, these currents that we were mentioning earlier. Quoting Father Seraphim again, but it will be extremely important for us to understand why it is false and how it went away from the truth. If we understand that, we have some idea of what goes on in the world today, and what is the intellectual structure against which we must fight. Although, while saying that everything I'm going to talk about is false, I mean it's false from the strictly orthodox point of view. There, the whole, of course, is relative compared to what happens in the world today. All of these movements we talk about, Thomas Aquinas to medieval art, to European Renaissance art, and so forth, they are all very much more valuable than anything that has been happening in the world today. Nonetheless, there is a whole underlying worldview which produced these things, and we can see how it was departing from orthodoxy. The history of the West from the schism of Rome is a logical and coherent whole, and the views which govern mankind today are a direct result of views held in the 13th century. And now that the Western philosophy dominates the entire world, there is no other philosophy except the Orthodox Christian philosophy which has any strength to it, because all civilizations have been overwhelmed by the West. This means that what happened in the West these last 900 years is the key to understanding what is happening in the whole world today." End quote. So you see, for Father Seraphim, history is moving in a direction, and that direction is towards redemption via cataclysm. We might say that as Orthodox Christians, we can be attentive to the fact that this cataclysm is ultimately eschatological and apocalyptic, and therefore not without hope. Christ reigns in this world and the next. But the power of Rose's analysis comes from directing the energy of this hope towards what Orthodox Christians need to attend to in the here and now. Father Seraphim's invocations of nihilism, with its attendant apocalyptic theologies concerning the Antichrist, is by no means superficial or offhanded. Indeed, chronicling the genealogy, trajectories, and projected telos of nihilism in the West was a signature preoccupation of his intellectual work, even prior to his becoming a monk. Just a bit of biography here. A precocious devotee of Bay Area bohemianism, and in particular that scene's appropriation of Zen Buddhism, then a relatively new and exoticized arrival to the West, via his teacher, Alan Watts, Father Seraphim's embrace of orthodoxy was, in a manner that many converts, such as Death to the World founder Justin Marlar also exemplifies, both forward-looking and retrospective. While in his monastic and eventually priestly vocation in life, he would dive deep into the vast world of Eastern Orthodox spirituality, a world that has more saints, writings, liturgies, ascetic traditions, and ecclesial particularities than anyone can hope to engage, much less master, in a lifetime. Much of his writing as a monk prior to his death in 1982 was, again, focused on what he took to be the nihilistic, and thus by extension demonic core of the cultural subcultural milieus that he had left behind. Speaking of Watts, we should note too that the young Eugene Rose's experiences with Watts' ultimate decadence and lack of philosophical seriousness preconditioned the later Father Seraphim to be particularly mindful of the dangers of gurus. We can appreciate that, I believe, even as we Orthodox are careful to make sure that our piety towards such holy figures as Father Seraphim takes on the proper liturgical character of honoring saints, rather than elevating celebrity gurus. That is the danger that attends popularity, especially in an internet age. And in my layman's opinion, it will take the Church's ongoing wisdom in the next few years, decades, and centuries to safeguard this distinction, should Father Seraphim's canonization process continue. Father Seraphim's method in analyzing what he took to be nihilism's undergirding of much Western culture, philosophy, religion, and politics was consistently genealogical and historical. In his major work on the subject, written just before founding the monastery, Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age, he traces the chronological development of explicitly nihilistic philosophy through its intensification via classic liberalism, then rationalism, vitalism, and finally the destructive impulses that he saw operative both in nascent postmodernism and totalitarianism. Throughout Father Seraphim's work, as has largely been the case with such movements as Death to the World, the three trajectories of nihilism as philosophy, totalitarianism as expounded particularly in Leninist-Stalinist Marxism as politics, and apocalyptic stirrings of the ascendancy of the Antichrist as theology, are intertwined and mutually reinforcing. As he commenced the work of founding and overseeing St. Herman's, he continued and expanded this tripart historical analysis in such works as 1975's Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, which applied this analysis particularly to so-called New Age religious movements, as well as what he called ecumenism, and even more so in his sweeping review of Western intellectual history post-schism in the aforementioned and highly influential Orthodox Survival course, variations of which are still being taught by such modern thinkers as Father Peter Heers, Father Spiridon Bailey, and so on. Unsurprisingly, but to a degree and in a manner worthy of comment, is the centrality of Friedrich Nietzsche to both Father Seraphim's account of nihilism as well as that, again, of Death to the World and other contemporary Orthodox outreach movements. In particular, Nietzsche's famous image in The Gay Science of the so-called madman in the marketplace is evocative of both the theological backdrop to Father Seraphim's contention, channeling Dostoevsky, that if there is no God, then all is permitted, and to the particular overtones of rebellion that movements such as Death to the World would later amplify, not least by quoting that madman in the marketplace section often. And for those that have read Nietzsche, you remember this is when the madman is going throughout the marketplace of bourgeois atheists saying God is dead. And even though many of the people are unbelievers, they still mock this man. And yet it is this madman who understands that if it is truly the case that there is no metaphysical foundation for the sort of morality that was at play in contemporary society, then in fact something new and disruptive was needed. As a number of scholars have pointed out, the theological conflict described in Nietzsche's parable is not first and foremost between Christian theistic believers and atheists. Rather, the conflict is between, on the one hand, what Nietzsche saw as his era's refined bourgeois unbelievers, who cling to the anemic vestiges of liberal society and its values, even after the metaphysical verities that ostensibly inspired and supported them have been evacuated. And on the other hand, is the prophet who understands that this evacuation, this death of God, has rendered all these morals vacuous and untenable. To rebel against God is ultimately spiritual death, but perhaps even more pernicious in our time is the slow, tragic attenuation, the slow, awful spiritual rigor mortis of uncaring secularism, distraction, and delusions of progress and modernity. This was Rose's diagnosis. The main thing I want to suggest, foreshadowing Death to the World's tagline, The Last True Rebellion, is that for Father Seraphim, what is at stake in Nietzsche is the nature of true rebellion. Father Seraphim could and did grudgingly acknowledge the superiority of Nietzsche's passionate philosophical atheism to cultured bourgeois unbelief, or even nominal belief that carries no passion or commitment. Father Seraphim had spent much of his young adulthood in a similarly intense atheistic state. As with Nietzsche, even young Eugene Rose's rebellions against religion were God-haunted. For Father Seraphim, and for much of the movements he has inspired, if the choice is between the passion of Nietzsche and the lukewarmness of bourgeois belief, or even unbelief, then Father Seraphim resonates more with Nietzsche, even as he sees him too as the key figure of the philosophical and cultural nihilism that leads to disaster. In other words, even though Nietzsche is in some ways the primary prophet of nihilism for Father Seraphim was beginning to diagnose something perhaps even more tragic in our own day. Not God-haunted rebellion, but distracted, lazy, secularist apathy that foreshadows a very different kind of collapse, one that fails to see the gathering forces of darkness that are far less distracted than many of us are when it comes to spiritual struggle. This, I think, names one of the key aspects of Father Seraphim's appeal to truth seekers in the here and now. No compromises. Radical nihilism or radical belief are the only two honorable and ultimately viable alternatives, both in his philosophy and in his person. Father Seraphim provides a template for the sort of restless, rebellious seeker who finds in orthodoxy the only safe harbor against nihilism. Thank you.